Good evening and welcome to Conversations Live Climate Change. I'm Patty Satalia. President Trump has ordered an about-face on U.S. energy policy, walking back Obama-era policies aimed at curbing emissions and preparing the United States for the impacts of climate change. Will that stop the clean energy transition now underway? And what's at stake? Tonight, our panel of experts will answer those questions and yours. Now, let's meet our guests. Dr. Erica Smithwick is an associate professor of geography at Penn State. She's also the director of the Center for Landscape Dynamics, as well as the Laboratory for Landscape Ecology at Penn State. Her research includes global change biology. Dr. Richard Alley is an Evan Pugh professor of geosciences and an associate of the Earth and Environmental Systems Institute at Penn State. He participated in the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, which was co-recipient of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. Dr. Jonathan Brockop is an associate professor of history and religious studies at Penn State. He also directs the Initiative in Religion and Ethics for the Rock Ethics Institute and is developing a new course at Penn State called The Ethics of Climate Change. Thanks so much for being with us. You can join tonight's conversation. Our toll-free number is 1-800-543-8242, and our email address is connect@wpsu.org. You may also tweet your question or comment using the hashtag WPSUConversations. So I'll begin with you, Dr. Alley. Your research focuses on sea level rise and climate history, and you say we have already committed the world to about 1 degree in warmth. You say we're pretty much committed to the 2nd degree of warming. What will it take to prevent the 3rd degree of warming, and what will 3 degrees of warming feel like on the ground?
Right, so we have warmed global average about 1 Celsius, just over, almost 2 Fahrenheit. The land warms a little more than the ocean. Most of us live on the land. So we're pushing it up that we're starting to feel it. People are noticing. We're pretty well committed to doubling that. We could hold it, but it's going to take a lot of work. And we're worried about 3 and 4 and 5. A little bit of warming. We've dealt with a variable world. It's not very expensive. As you go to more warming, you start moving outside of anything we've experienced. The costs go up a lot faster than the temperature does. It's super linear. And the risk of discontinuities, scary things, West Antarctica collapsing and sea level going way up, goes up with the temperature. Avoiding that really takes implementing the technologies that we now know will work on a time scale that 30 years, by the time our students are in their prime, we need to be a good way onto that to avoid that 3rd degree.
The technologies we know that work. Explain.
We now know that we can generate all the energy that humanity uses and a whole lot more by farming it in renewable ways. We could do it in a bunch of different ways, and we can go nuclear, we can go carbon capture and sequestration, but wind and sun will do it. And we know that. The prices have been coming down, the yield has been going up, and so we know that in 30 years or so we can build this.
Dr. Brockop, my question really is a good follow-up to what Dr. Alley said. So we have all of these technologies that have been gaining steam over the years. To what extent will the Trump administration's rolling back of Obama-era policies stop or thwart those things from happening? And what does this mean for the Paris Agreement?
Well, there's no question that the current administration, the way that it's looking at energy, is not favorable towards renewables. But the fact is that so much is already baked into the system. We already have, for example, production tax credits that were agreed upon in a bipartisan manner at the end of 2015 that really have allowed the wind production companies to have a fair marketplace to understand what's going to happen in terms of tax credits, and so they've expanded massively. We now have a tremendous expansion in terms of both wind and solar employment because of this. So this is going to continue.
More than double coal mining, for example.
For example. And so this is going to continue regardless of what the administration decides to do. However, they can certainly throw roadblocks in, and I think even more importantly, all the continued investment in things like fossil fuel infrastructure is just wasted money, because eventually we will move away from fossil fuels.
Interesting. To you, Professor Smithwick, You would, I'm sure, refer to this as one of the wicked problems that you and your group works on, those problems that are not easily solved. You're involved in something here at Penn State called SCRIM, the Network for Sustainable Climate Risk Management, which is centered here at Penn State. Give us an idea of the disciplines involved in that and how you're helping communities adapt and manage to what's ahead.
Right. So along the lines of what Richard was saying, that we've already committed ourselves to warming. We know that these communities, especially urban communities under threat from things like sea level rise, need to start learning to adapt to some of the current stressors. So what SCRIM is doing, it's a multi-institutional research network, and it is taking a very holistic approach to these solutions. To say we need to work with all the communities involved, we need to understand the philosophies around what people want about the ethics of change. What do they want their cities to be in the future? But we also need to involve ecologists, people doing wetlands, people understanding forests. And then we need to involve people who understand uncertainty and risk and how to put forward the statistical, robust decision-making philosophies that will help move cities to the next level of change.
Dr. Smithwick mentioned uncertainties, and so much of what I'm reading about this talks about this in terms of the deep uncertainties, which is a license to some to say, well, there's too much that's unknown, so we shouldn't invest in anything, and others who are saying, no, 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 deep uncertainty means that you do, action is necessary. Explain, why you don't talk about this in terms of worst case or best case scenario. Why do you remind us that there are deep uncertainties?
Because there are. There are things that there are deep certainties. CO2 is a greenhouse gas. We are raising CO2. This is having a warming influence on the climate. There's basically no uncertainty about those statements. They are as confident as almost anything we can say in science. What exactly that means to you has some uncertainty. What that will cost, what is the best way to deal with it. And the uncertainties tend to be mostly on the bad side. Sea level rise. We're expecting 2 or 3 feet by the end of the century if we continue on the present
And already
course.
it's risen 7.5, right?
Inches, something like that, right? But we're expecting 2 or 3 feet. What are the uncertainties? It might be 1 or 2, it might be 15. Most of the room is on the bad side, and this keeps coming up. So in fact, it's fairly clear if you sort of average over all possibilities, the more uncertain we are, the more worrisome climate change is, the more reason to take actions now to hold it down.
But if your action is a seawall, the difference in how high that sea level rise is might mean the difference of a 10-foot seawall or a seawall won't do it at all, right?
Indeed. This is a real concern that the worst cases are hard to build for. And so taking actions to lower the warming so we lower the risk of a really big sea level rise while dealing with what we will see.
So I just want to piggyback on that because there are some certainties and some uncertainties when we talk about the ethics as well. So one of the things we know without a doubt is that we have historically put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere burning fossil fuels than any other country. We also know that the countries, by and large, that have produced the most carbon dioxide are not the ones who are going to suffer the most. There's uncertainty exactly what will happen. For example, how fast the seas will rise, and so exactly what's going to happen in South Florida. But what we do know is that countries that don't have the infrastructure to be able to survive this kind of onslaught, these wicked problems, are the ones that are going to suffer the most. And so there really is a fundamental justice issue here.
And we know, and I'm going to take our first call in just a moment, that the Obama administration funded a $1 billion climate green fund to help countries like the ones you've just described. This is one of the things that the Trump administration says they will not renew. Your comments on that, Dr. Smithwick?
Well, it is unfortunate because the vulnerable people that are going to suffer are going to see the most disturbances, they're going to see the most fires, they're going to see the most floods, but they also do not have the resources to adapt to it. So people who have resources are going to do okay. People can move, but people who don't have those resources are not going to be able to adapt.
All right, and we'll take our first phone call. We have Amber on the line from State College. Go ahead, please, Amber. Amber. Amber, are you there?
Yes, this is Amber. I was wondering, this isn't going to be a super concise question just because I don't know how to phrase it, but I'm asking, a lot of people that maybe oppose climate change, which as an idea I think is dumb, but for the science I don't agree that that's, okay. But anyway, they oppose it because they think there's going to be a high cost to people. And, coal is a lot cheaper. We depend on lots of fuels that we already have. And I'm just wondering, where to look and where to find out about the costs of transitioning over to other fuels. We live in a pretty wealthy area here in State College in the center region, but I know lots of people don't. And I just wonder about the cost and if that's being considered, as a justice issue also. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll begin with you, Dr. Alley.
Right. So in many places now, adding a little bit of energy to the grid, the cheapest ones are often wind and sometimes solar. So the making right now, if we tried to go completely renewables, it would be hard. But if we made a 30-year transition, we can. The economists have looked at this carefully, and they have asked, what is the optimal path to take care of people today and in the future? And the answer is it is cheaper overall to start now to deal with this carefully and in a measured way than to ignore it for a while. You get a bigger economy overall if you take wise policies starting now than if you ignore it.
And of course, there are costs associated with inaction that aren't even calculated into the cost of energy.
Absolutely. So it's the full picture. If you do sort of what Scrim does, you take a complete view of the situation. Taking a wise approach, knowing where we want to go, knowing where we came from, you end up with a bigger economy and more jobs, as well as dealing with the ethical and environmental issues.
Right.
I think, if I may, I think there's we often conflate the issue around around jobs and around the economy. And unfortunately, we don't get the messaging that this type of innovation and even the science itself can produce jobs. And so what we need is to just find that lever that promotes the transition, because we've transitioned from other forms of energy before. So we need incentives and we need innovation, but we could get there and have a viable economy.
And in a way, going back to coal, when we see other countries moving away, decreasing their dependence on coal, sounds to me in some respects like going back to the horse and buggy as a transportation or a...
Right, and other countries are taking advantage of our slowness on this issue.
Right.
You wanted to add to that, Dr.
Absolutely.
Franco?
I mean, when we take this overall picture, you're both exactly right. We can look at the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast. They have reduced the output carbon for about 40%, I think, in terms of energy production, while still growing the economy by around 8%. So that's an overall lesson. But Amber is really right, is that when it comes down to the individual personal level, what am I going to do with my big gas guzzler car? How am I going to afford that in the new economy when gas prices will have a carbon tax or something like this? This is what people are really...
Or will her electric bill be higher if she's using alternative fuel for electric generation as opposed to coal?
No, exactly right. And so I think it's terribly important to take these things into consideration. So one of the very specific pieces of policy that's on the table right now is not, they don't call it a carbon tax, they call it a fee and dividend. And the idea is that you do add to the price of something like gasoline, but then that's returned to people on the basis of their income. And so the idea here is really to help those who have the least in order to be just within our own system.
All right. I'm going to go to an email question and then a phone call. This one from Lee. He writes, does the world's cooperation on reducing or eliminating chlorofluorocarbons and turning around the ozone problem give you optimism about the world taking such measures to curb global warming? Or does the anti-science, anti-environment tenor of the current administration make you pessimistic about the future of our planet? Richard Alley.
Hi, Lee, and thank you for the question. There was, when the ozone hole popped in, when people realized what was going on, there was a bit of fake news on that. I was speaking recently to a scientist who was subjected to insults and things that some of us are familiar with on the climate issues. There was pushback against doing anything. And then we came up with a technical solution, which is beautiful. It's clean, it's inexpensive, it's implemented, we're winning. And
What was the solution? Because
ultimately it was different refrigerants that do the job of refrigerating without doing the job of breaking down the ozone.
And our refrigerators still work.
The refrigerators still work.
Imagine that.
So we won on that one. And because the price of alternative fuels has been going down so much, we know we can win on this one. And that's really where I become optimistic, is that we can see a path to a future with more energy, much more. Right? We can get the amount of wind and sun which is out there once we learn how to build this can dwarf what we're getting now.
And yet at the national level, though, you have this emphasis on fossil fuels, and you have some states where governors are forbidding even the use of the term climate change. So how do you get around those sorts of things?
Yeah, we're working on it. We're working on it. The callers are here. We talk about it. We talk about the good that is out there. The surveys tend to show that most Americans now believe there are good solutions to this, and most Americans aren't talking about it. And so it's getting the word out there that we actually are on the edge of something really wonderful if we use our knowledge with respect and ambition.
All right. We go to Kay, who's calling us from Sugar Valley. Go ahead, please, Kay.
Hi. Thanks for taking my call. I burn oil and I burn pellets, okay? But that's not my question. I want to know what the average citizen, the average person can do to help help the world, and on a simple level, without going and spending thousands and thousands of dollars for something you really don't understand. That's my question.
All right, Dr. Branca?
It's a lovely question, and thank you so much for that. The wonderful thing about climate change is it's a problem so large that you can pick almost any piece of it and really have an impact. And so, sure, it's important to think about our own individual carbon footprint, the amount of fossil fuels that we use directly, and there are lots of ways to deal with that. But there's also food, for example. Moving to a lower meat diet actually makes a difference.
Replacing chicken for beef has a huge impact.
That's right. So there's lots of little things that can be done. I think tremendously important is to join a group, to be part of, whether it's Pennsylvania Interfaith Power and Light, Citizens Climate Lobby, Sierra Club. There are so many groups out there right now that are really mobilizing on this issue. And so to join with others, that way your activity can be multiplied.
You know, that brings me to you, Dr. Smithwick, because there are literally 660 and counting cities across the country who are involved, who are becoming, they're part of this compact of mayors. They're involved in the resilience cities. They've got resilience officers who are working to help their cities and their citizens make the kinds of changes that Jonathan Brock just mentioned.
That's right. And so creating those resilient societies really involves changing the institutions sometimes and changing policies. And so that does mean stepping out of your comfort zone sometimes and talking to your senator, or just going to your local community group and getting involved. And sometimes that's difficult at first, but once you start to see where you can make the change, it can really help. So I work a lot in the area of fire science, and in that we were seeing a lot more fire. The tempo and the severity of fires are increasing due to climate change and a number of other historical influences. And in urban cities, especially out west, you have this intermingling zone of urban systems and wild systems where we have lots of vulnerable communities. And so what we really need to do in that case is not stop fire, because we probably won't, but to work on zoning and to work on how to have defensible zones around your own home. So that's a very sort of dialing in on one particular climate problem, but again, it involves collaboration at multiple levels and multiple institutions.
And you say scientists have to, in addition to being an ecologist or an engineer or a climate scientist, we need to be sociologists as well to help Americans make these tough decisions.
It pains me because I just want to talk about trees all the time. but yes, we have to talk about people. So So and really, that's where the interesting science is too, is figuring out how to make natural science and social science work together to create sustainable society.
You've mentioned before that 50% of the U.S. population lives along the coast, so of course they're vulnerable to floods. But when you mention fires, there is this fear that fires that we tend to think of as happening in the West are moving to the Northeast.
Right. Well, we just heard in the news recently this year about Gatlinburg. And a lot of our fires burn in the Southeast, and actually most of those are human ignitions. And we have a bigger WUI zone. We call it WUI. It's wildland urban interface, this zone of urban and wild systems. And fire people are funny people. So the WUI zone is bigger in the east. And we don't think of our systems as being fire prone, but given a longer drought, given less snow, we could start to become more vulnerable, and then we are really going to be in trouble.
All right. We're going to go to another email. This question comes to us from Patricia, who writes, humans have innovative ways to adapt to climate change to a great extent. Other species do not. How many species can we expect to go extinct if we don't address climate change? And you say we're already in the sixth.
Yeah, we're kind of in the sixth extinction. E.O. Wilson, a famous scientist at Harvard, has said we need to actually move to a half Earth model, where we actually put half of the Earth into conservation right now if we hope to avoid this. I mean, we're very far from that. A very small percentage of our land and our sea, even much smaller percentage of our sea, is actually in conservation status. So
what's most vulnerable?
In terms of
extinction?
Well, there's so much. I particularly am right now worried about corals. Coral ecosystems are under threat from disease and land use, and this is coming from a terrestrial ecologist, but the signals are really scary there in terms of what's happening to those systems, the bleaching events, extreme sensitivity to temperature, and inability to migrate and move.
Dr. Alley.
So just to add to that, that's great, is whenever we stop it, we just miss the worst. Because species are the same as us. A little bit of change is a little bit of damage, and more change is a lot more damage, and more change is a lot more damage. So as we raise temperature, the risk to the species goes up faster than the temperature does. So whenever we stop, we just miss the worst.
Mm-hmm. And even if we stop today, that warming is going to exist for...
There'll still be some, but we will have missed the worst. Okay. So we can do a lot of good, and that's not to be fatalistic.
Yeah.
If we wait, there are costs, and the longer you wait, the bigger the costs. Getting started earlier has big benefits.
Okay. We go to David, who's calling us from Lewistown. Go ahead, please, David.
I was wondering why we concentrate on the climate change as far as temperature, when we know 40, 50 years ago it was all the rage to talk about thousands of years we've gone through change and its temperature going up, where we used to have an ice age. Rather, why are we hanging on this now rather than concentrate on not climate change as much as what this carbon footprint change, what this is doing to the atmosphere in regard to the health of people? I don't know that the temperature change is going to, this cleaning it up is going to change it, the cyclical thing that's been going on for thousands of years. But the cleanup of the atmosphere, I say yes, it's for the health of the people. Why do we concentrate on the other and forgetting about the major aspect of preserving the atmosphere for people?
Dr. Brockup?
Well, I think, there are several issues here, and I want to hear, especially from Richard, about the overall time period. But there's one piece of this, and that is that temperature is not the only effect of the increase of carbon dioxide. Another effect is the increasing acidification of the oceans. So it is right in a sense that temperature is not everything. And that the more CO2 we have in the atmosphere, the more acidic our oceans become. And that has a direct effect on shellfish and many other animals.
And of course,
as well.
then human health, because we eat those shellfish.
Right.
And there are toxins as the ocean acidifies. Dr. Smith?
Yeah, I would just add in terms of human health and climate change, there are a number of diseases that we need to start worrying about that are sensitive to temperature. So we're even seeing the mosquitoes that carry dengue coming to Pennsylvania. So you have people perhaps that are vectors, and these mosquitoes are also here because they can now overwinter. And so there are health consequences of climate change that are related to temperature. But I think the point you raise is a good one in terms of pollution. And we have learned over time that with the acid rain problem, for example, that we know how to solve that problem. We've done a good job. We haven't solved it completely. We still have a lot of sulfur in our atmosphere and a lot of nitrogen, primarily from these coal burning plants. But the good news is that if you could solve two birds with one stone there. So
unless we turn back the Clean Power Plan.
Well, right.
Okay.
Right. And David, thank you. Climate has always changed. Fires have always happened, but arson is a problem. Climate has always changed, but we're now changing it. Over the last 50 years or so, nature has tried to cool it off a little bit, but we have warmed it more. When we go back and look at the long history of climate, we find many things have mattered, but CO2 has been most important. And we find that when CO2 was changed naturally, things died. Things migrated, big creatures became dwarfed when it got hot. There were huge impacts. And so we are doing something that nature has done in the past. It had huge impacts, but we are doing it faster.
In fact, the University of Southampton in the UK is saying that we may see warming that we haven't seen on this planet in 55 million years.
Absolutely. This is very clear. And we learned about these past changes first by seeing what they did to living systems. The last time nature changed CO2 a lot, the coral reefs disappeared. There was extinction on the seafloor. The large mammals became dwarfed because it was too hot. And we're doing something that could be as big, if we keep doing it, faster.
All right. If you're just joining us, I'm Patty Satalia, and this is Conversations Live Climate Change on WPSU. Our guests tonight are Dr. Erica Smithwick, an associate professor of geography at Penn State and the director of the Center for Landscape Dynamics, Dr. Richard Alley, an Evan Pugh professor of geosciences at Penn State and author of The 2-Mile Time Machine, Ice Cores, Abrupt Climate Change, and Our Future, and Dr. Jonathan Brockop, an associate professor of history and religious studies at Penn State and the organizer of the annual Bike Ride to Washington, a religious response to climate change. Our telephone number is 1-800-543-8242, and our panel is ready to take your phone calls. If you'd prefer to email us, our address is connect@wpsu.org. And we go now to Keith, who has been patiently hanging on in State College. Go ahead, please, Keith.
Thank you for taking my call. I see the solution ultimately to the climate change issue is just electing politicians that are more receptive or are receptive to these things that you're all talking to about. I mean, we have people that are just, have vested interests and are just outright opposing any solutions to climate change. So I just see the ultimate solution again is we've got to get new leadership in this country that is going to be receptive to things like green energy.
And of
Thanks
course,
again.
All right, thank you. And of course, that would require us to do something about gerrymandering first, right? Okay. So we'll take our next email. We have another email question that just came in, if I can see that. I've always thought of evolution as a very slow, gradual process. Climate change seems to be occurring very rapidly and even accelerating. How do living things adapt to these radically changing environments over such a brief period of time, which is sort of what we were talking about a moment ago. I'll begin with you, Dr. Smithwick.
Sure, yeah. I mean, evolution and adaptation are very, very slow processes. So that is exactly our concern, that the pace of climate change is happening faster than species can adapt. I mean, one of the things we really think about are mismatches. So the timing of when the flowers bloom to when the bees can visit it. And, those kinds of things that are happening outside right now, if they go wrong, then there's a whole cascade of other things that go wrong. So a lot of the science right now is focusing on things like phenology, the timing of when things come to spring out. And that will have lots of other consequences for ecosystem processes.
All right. Anything to add? Okay, I'll go to our next question. This comes from Ethan, who is calling us from Phillipsburg. Go ahead, please, Ethan.
Hi, thanks for taking my call.
You're welcome.
Earlier, agriculture came up as a means of mitigating climate change. I was really curious what the panelists thought about the impact of climate change on food security, both internationally and also here in the U.S.
Thank you. Good question. Dr. Smithwick?
In full disclosure, that is my graduate student asking the question. He has done a marvelous thesis that he just defended on this topic. So we should let him answer. But I'll save him for the moment. Yeah, so food security is a big problem. We really need to consider the fact that climate change is decreasing yields already. And 20% or something decreases are projected in the future. And when we then start to consider that we are also facing large increases in population, trying to feed 9 billion people, maybe more, in the future, where is that food going to come from? And so we're kind of running out of land. So a lot of the innovation has to come not just on the technical side in terms of solutions to fossil fuel, but how are we going to feed people? And how are we going to create sustainable communities? I mean, it's great if we can breathe the good air, but if our bellies are empty, then that won't work either. So we do have a land problem, and it's related to food security, and unfortunately, food security is threatened by changing climate.
Dr. Brockup?
Well, and for an example, there was a drought in the southeast a number of years ago. The peanut crop was affected. Peanut butter prices went up. So I buy a jar of peanut butter maybe once every couple of weeks. Doesn't really affect me. But if you're in a situation where food is a major part of your weekly outlay, whether that's because you're poor here in the United States or you're abroad, then these changes that are happening now really are going to affect those poor populations much more than those of us who can afford to pay a little more for our peanut butter.
Mm-hmm. All right. We go to another email question. This one comes to us from Will, who writes, given the threat of climate change, you said that scientists and engineers need to also play the part of sociologists. Well, they're listening to us here. In that vein, what is the best way, or is it possible, to make climate change action a bipartisan issue? Richard Alley?
I'll start. So the first time I testified to a subcommittee of the U.S. Senate was 14 years ago. It was chaired by a Republican who wanted to put on a price on carbon because that was the conservative approach to dealing with the problem. This is a bipartisan issue, is recent. It wasn't that long ago that bipartisan wanted to find solutions. They didn't want to argue about it. There's nothing natural about a party yelling at the other party about their facts. And how we get back to that is a little bit hard, but this is a very recent development that this is being considered political because the facts aren't.
And Michael Mann would say that that science is being swift-boated because people who are in power are there and keeping their seats because they've been funded by the fossil fuel industries.
We certainly know that growing out of tobacco, among other places, that there have been efforts to confuse good people about what we know. People who decided that they wanted to win the policy debate by not having it. And I think we're winning now and getting the facts to people so that they can start having the serious debate about how do we make people live well now and in the future. And that's the real issue.
Dr. Brockup.
Well, and thinking about what brings people together, this is one of the reasons why I think ethics is so important, because there are fundamental values that we share and that we can really talk about across the aisle. And I think it's also important not to overemphasize the partisan divide in Washington. There is something called the Climate Solutions Caucus, which was started by two representatives from South Florida, a Republican and a Democrat, realizing that South Florida is in dire straits right now in terms of sea level rise. And the way this caucus is established, you have to have an equal number of Republicans and an equal number of Democrats. Right now there are 14 of each, so it's growing. And this is a growing bipartisan movement in Congress right now.
You know, and it's worth mentioning that San Diego, which has a Republican governor, is doing more in terms of climate action than I think any other city in America. Maybe some. And then Salt Lake City, Utah, which is one of the reddest states in the country, is also on track to being, I think, zero carbon.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some, as Jonathan said, some similarities here that we really need to embrace. The religious community can be a really strong partner for us, for example. I mean, the Pope has embraced us addressing climate change from a social justice and ethical perspective as much as anything. So there are places of unity that I think we can work with. And on the other hand, there is a business case for this. And I think we need to do a better job of making that case.
And in fact, Bob Inglis, a former South Carolina Republican who lost his seat when he started to say that not only is climate change real, but we need to do something about it, that it's we have a moral obligation to do so, says part of the problem is that that perhaps Democrats describe it as a problem only, not as an opportunity. And we have Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York City and the former executive director of Sierra Club, saying that climate change has an enormous opportunity for public health and for the economy. So, okay, we'll go to Anne, who writes to us. She says, remember how we were told to change from charcoal to gas grills to help the environment? Should we be giving up our wood-burning stoves? And how about those who are heating their homes by coal-burning stoves? Dr. Brockup?
Well, you know, the individual home level is pretty minor in terms of the overall picture of emissions. It's the big, huge coal-fired power plants in Pennsylvania that make us one of the largest emitters, actually, in the world. If Pennsylvania were a country, we'd be down at like number 27 or 28 in the entire world. So those choices, I think, a lot of things come into that. You know, one of the things about burning wood is that it is part of the natural cycle.
And it's going to become carbon dioxide even if it rots out in the woods.
Right,
That's
you're
true.
accelerating the pace, but as
Yeah.
long as you're planting a few trees as well, that carbon can get sequestered within a reasonable time frame. You can't rebuild coal over a human lifetime, so or many human lifetimes. So we need to, I think it's probably a pretty sustainable choice to be burning wood in this day and age, if forced to stay warm in some capacity.
That takes us back to the Clean Power Plan, which was this Obama-era effort to get coal-fired power plants to be cleaner. The Trump administration says that's probably going to be rolled back. And the reality is, you know, not all coal-fired power plants are created equal. Some of the dirtiest ones are creating the least amount of electricity and the most pollution. So it concerns me that the Clean Power Plan may be rescinded. Yeah, Richard Alley?
There certainly have been studies that have looked at the health impacts of breathing the particles from coal-fired power. And the general conclusion is that overall the health benefits, the health damages cost society more than the electricity does. But the range from reasonably small to huge was very real. And so you look across all the plants, and some of them clearly did much more harm than others. In addition to the particles, there's mercury. There's a lot of mercury deposited from coal, and other sorts of things come out. So there's a lot of impacts from some of the coal-fired power plants in addition to the climate change.
And of course, the whole Clean Power Plan brings us back to this idea of environmental justice or climate justice.
Right. I mean, I think at some point we need to weigh these things, not just on a monetary basis. We really need to start thinking about what we're doing to our environment. And we have been through this before in Pennsylvania. We had streets that were smogged up because of coal before, and we learned that that was not good for us. And so it would be a shame if we went backwards rather than forwards.
All right. So this email comes to us from Mary, who writes, the Bill O'Reilly ad exodus is proof that corporate America is willing to take serious action when there's public outcry. Are there any corporate partners in the environmental justice movement? And what about corporate-funded deception? What's the best way to either expose them to the public or pressure them to be better corporate citizens?
Well, there's recently an article on this in the New York Times. The number of Fortune 500 companies, I think it's half of them, that have either already reduced their carbon footprint or are in the process of doing so. A number of these companies are already at zero So they have gone carbon neutral.
Well, can you name it one or two?
Google, for example. I mean, Google wants it to be known as this. And so this gets into that corporate whitewashing thing, right? Because they do want to be recognized, and they get cachet for this, that they are known, and that when you store your material with Google, you're not wasting forests or other things. So this is the corporate environment, I think, can definitely be a partner in terms of, and in fact must be a partner. This is all hands on deck. Everyone has to take part.
Anything to
I
add?
would just say that companies come all the time to Penn State to say, help us do this. And so a lot of us meet with these companies and they want to find those solutions. So investing in those small businesses that and helping them be more nimble to make that transition is going to be really important.
Okay, another email. This one comes to us from Tess. Tess writes, a lot of the conversation these days seems to focus on adaptation. What happened to prevention or avoidance? Are things too far gone? People with resources can adapt, but what about trees and other plants and animals? How do they adapt? And we had a similar question. Anything to add to that?
The short answer is yes. We're in the position now where we have to talk about adaptation mitigation. I think it's really important when we're thinking about this to understand historically that scientists have known for decades that we were raising CO2 levels by burning fossil fuels. And so this
Bell Labs was saying this in the 50s.
Since 1896.
1896,
Oh my
Arrhenius in
God.
Sweden, yes.
So we are late to the game. And yes, therefore we must talk about mitigation and adaptation.
Not only are we late to the game, China is investing more than any other country, more than $1 billion, I think 1.2, almost $1.3 billion in alternative fuels. How do we compare, Dr. Smithwick?
I don't have the numbers at the tip of my tongue, but I will use that adaptation argument in terms of fire because we are spending more money right now. We're spending $13 billion, to put that in context, just on fighting fires. And so if we could take that $13 billion and invest it, we spent $13 billion in the last 10 years, and invest it instead in renewable energy, then we would be going a long way to helping our cities be more adaptable.
And you, Dr. Alley, said that the Katrina flooding cost us $300 per man, woman, and child in this country.
Big. So there we can, as I mentioned before, we can do well economically if we use this information. There were some interesting studies that looked at, so if we make the economy bigger, we get more jobs. But they also looked at what happens to early adapters and found that the people who are leading, who are spawning the new industries, are the ones that benefit the most from employment. So if you are ahead of the competition in building new industry, you get the jobs.
Wow. So let's go to another email. This one's from Ted, who writes, could you speak to the tremendous benefits that would accrue to the American economy if we focused on being the world's leader in clean tech, which could be exported, and to the tremendous health benefits that you have noted that could accrue to the country with the elimination of heavy metal-laden coal plant emissions?
So we don't have to go overseas for that latter part. Again, looking at the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, in addition to lowering their carbon footprint and increasing the economy, they also saved lives. So the health benefits for switching, especially from burning coal, are real and absolute. But the other question, I think, is also really important, and that is that by being a leader in terms of green energy, the U.S. can really help the rest of the world adapt and really make a difference. And so I think there's a lot that we can, and we do this here at Penn State already. We have so much important research into solar, and I hear that there are new solar concepts that are coming out all the time.
But are people continuing to come to the United States when our position on climate change has so drastically changed from one administration to another? I'm just wondering if there's been a drop-off in people who are seeking consultation and advice and technologies from the U.S.? Dr. Smithwick.
A recent report to the Faculty Senate would suggest that the numbers of people who have applied has not dropped yet. There may be some signals that not as many people will actually come, but we'll wait to see on that one. It's out. The verdict is out. I think people are waiting to see what we do next. I think there's a window of opportunity. I think what we really need to capitalize on is the creativity that America has always been known for, and we have to take that intellectual power and be able to grow it.
Okay. Here's an email question. This one comes to us from Lori, who writes, "The Global March for Science had an encouraging turnout, even in red states, but will anything change? What more can we do?" Dr. Richard Alley?
Yeah, I mean, I'll try. I think it will change. I think we're starting to see this happening. The recognition of the ways forward is growing. And I go back to what Erica and Jonathan said already, which is part of it is talking. These surveys that show Americans believe there are good solutions and Americans are not talking about it. And part of it is talking. Part of it is you're a citizen, and that means being part of the process. It means voting and thinking about who you vote for. And then pick something. Pick a group. Get with a group. Jonathan mentioned one before, and I probably shouldn't be plugging groups, but I was at an event recently of Pennsylvania Interfaith Power and Light. If you are a person of faith, it's a remarkable group.
Well, let's get to that, because you are about to do your 6th ride to Washington, D.C., a 4-day trip to talk with your elected officials to say climate change action matters. What difference have you made?
I think it's really important to get out on the street, whether it's the March for Science, whether it's the climate march that's happening on Saturday. Our event is, as you say, this is our 6th year. This year we've got 17 riders riding bicycles from State College all the way to Washington.
So no carbon footprint there?
No carbon footprint there. In fact, it's my Chevy Volt, an electric car that will be accompanying us on the way. And we will be stopping at congregations. There's going to be a big event in Huntingdon that's being organized in coalition with the Citizens Climate Lobby and with Stone Church of the Brethren there. So we are trying in all of these communities that we stop in to start these conversations and to see what communities are doing right now, whether it's community gardens, whether it's thinking about transportation. There are so many ways that individual communities can be responding right now.
Has the faith community changed? Because there was this perception that that lots of people in the faith community, those who didn't believe in evolution, for example, also didn't believe in climate change, or that climate change was a human concern.
So the faith community absolutely has changed. Demographically, many Americans identify as religious, but not necessarily belonging to a particular religion. So there's kind of that global change, and with that, people still are looking for a moral center. They're still trying to figure out a way to do good in society. I honestly believe this. I don't think you have to be a person of faith to really want to do good by other people. And so the realization that this is a moral issue and that it's affecting not only us but people all over the world, I think is something that actually will encourage more people of faith and others, to become involved.
How does framing it as a moral issue change the conversation? And I ask that because I remember in the early days, the Obama administration talked about green jobs, and it wasn't until Obama's 2nd term where he started to talk about what we were leaving to our children and our grandchildren.
So I think there are many aspects of this, but I think the most important thing is that when you talk about this as a moral issue, it no longer is just about me and my job and how am I going to do things. It starts to be about us. And so by moving that conversation into a larger world of society as a moral question, then I think we're in this all together. And that fundamentally changes the way we look at this.
All right. We go to another email. This one comes to us from Jim. He writes, "Isn't it a big problem for us today, the practice of normative science? How do we get the genie back in the bottle?" I'm not sure what he means. Do you, Richard Alley?
Off the top of my head, I'm not sure. And Jim, if you wanted to send in something, I will say, for what it's worth, science is what we humans have always done. We learn from people around us, we learn from our elders, we look at the world around us, we want to know because we're curious and we want to help people and we want to help future generations. And then science has added one additional thing to what people always did, which is that we've all agreed to play by a set of rules that make it as hard as possible for us to fool ourselves. And we're still people, we can still mess it up, but we hew deeply and passionately to these rules of peer review and hypothesis testing, and all that is trying to keep us from fooling ourselves so we can't fool you. And otherwise, science is just people doing what people have always done.
Very good. We go to Richard, who's calling us from Frenchville. Richard, go ahead, please.
Go ahead, ma'am. Yes, I realize you're working on the coal situation, but I can't understand why the jet engines that fly like 24,000 takeoff and landings a day, and the United States has no pollution control at all. They burn millions and millions of gallons of fuel. I think that should be looked into very strong because that has to be polluting the atmosphere the way they fly.
Jonathan Brager?
I think it's a really important point. The difference is that with a coal-fired power plant, we know what to do about that. We can substitute a lower impact kind of way of producing electricity. That's fairly straightforward. How do you change air travel? It's something that we really must be thinking about. If you're in Europe, they've got high-speed rail. You can get from Berlin to Paris, no problem, Paris to London. But here in the United States, we're still very much married to air travel, and that's a worry for the future.
You know, speaking of the future, I wanted to talk about coal miners. We've got 6,600 coal miners in Pennsylvania, many of whom may be out of a job. I mean, the Trump administration is trying to pump up that industry. But if demand is down, so I'm wondering, you know, what opportunities are there for them, and how concerned should we be about a whole group of people who could be looking for work?
So first, there is some work looking at biofuels and aviation.
Right.
So there is some innovation there, and actually using biofuels for aviation might be easier than using it for other energy because it's more concentrated, and if you have the biorefinery next to the aviation. So there are interesting things going on in that front. So in terms of coal miners, yeah, absolutely. And you know, as a professor at Penn State, we have the children of coal miners in our classroom, right? So we need to understand what their future is going to be. And are they going to go back and work in the coal mines, or are they going to have other opportunities moving forward? So I'd love to say that we could just, on a dime, have a job transition training program that has those people employed at a higher level to clean up the coal mines. And that, you know, we could do that if we so chose as a society. In the meantime, we have to start looking for more creative solutions.
So how likely is clean coal? Because we often go back to that argument that can we ever clean coal enough or burn it cleanly enough that it's something that we could do? Richard Alley.
We could do it, but it probably is not going to be cost effective because without catching the CO2 and putting it back in the ground, right now coal is having troubles competing. Cheap gas has been very hard on coal. And cheap gas it's generally agreed that the big problem for coal now has been gas. So the free market worked and something better came along. And this has always been a problem. The canal boats hauled the railroad ties up the canal to build the railroad and put themselves out of business. The question is, do we try to help the people who are displaced or not? And that is a political decision. We can indeed say we're a big country, we have resources, we need to help them. They did good things for us, we owe them something. Or we could say it's a free market, to heck with it. And that's and I could offer opinions, but that's a political decision.
Okay. We go now to Robert with an email. He writes, given that we are going to have to abandon coal, what do we do about the coal miners? We're a little out of sync here. For example, could we tell them that if they want to retire, we as a society will pay them their current salary for the rest of their lives? Interesting.
So we could, and again, this is a kind of political decision. You have a limited number of resources. How are you going to spend this? But I think I just want to pick up on something Richard said, because I think it's tremendously important to honor those who have worked in the fossil fuel industry. Just because we foresee that this country will eventually move away from coal and natural gas doesn't mean that those who are out there right now in the coal mines are somehow bad people. And so it's tremendously important that we honor that and that we think about these jobs as we're moving on into some kind of future.
Just as we've chosen to do for veterans, for example.
Exactly.
I'm going to try to quickly take this last call. This is a call from Larry in Spring Mills. Do you have a quick question for us, Larry?
Yes, a number of years ago when Penn State was able to buy electricity from different suppliers, I asked specifically if Penn State would buy from, I think it was Green Mountain, which I think generated both from electricity and maybe solar, and they decided not to do that, decided to go with the cheapest supplier. I wonder today what Penn State is buying as far as their energy or generating their own. Is it carbon? What is the carbon footprint? What is the percentage? And, can you force them into doing more?
Sure. We'll get that. Dr. Brockup?
So Penn State has a plan to reduce its carbon footprint and has already reduced its carbon footprint over 2005 levels by over 20%, with a direct plan to get down to 35% below. Part of how Penn State has done this is switching over from coal to natural gas, and part has to do with increasing combined heat and power. So the combined heat and power plant, to answer the caller's question, produces electricity directly. These are gigantic turbines that actually are made to produce electricity, and with the waste heat, Penn State heats the steam which feeds over 100 buildings on campus.
So we're working on it.
So we are working on it.
All right. So, you've pointed out, Dr. Alley, that each American produces about 19 tons of carbon dioxide each year. Significant. So in just a couple of seconds, beginning with you, Dr. Smithwick, what take-home message, what can we do as individuals?
We can change our behavior and we can speak to our representatives.
Dr. Richard Alley.
It's a fantastic opportunity. We can use it.
All right. Thank you all so much for being with us. Our guests tonight are Dr. Erica Smithwick, an associate professor of geography at Penn State, Dr. Richard Alley, an Evan Pugh professor of geosciences at Penn State, and Dr. Jonathan Brockup, who directs the Initiative on Religion and Ethics for Penn State's Rock Ethics Institute. I'm Patty Satalia. For all of us here at WPSU, thanks for joining us. Have a good night.